My life took a turn for the worse at the age of 29 because of my ex. My girlfriend Rachel and my old best friend Luke lived together at the time. I'd been seeing Rachel for a few years, and while we weren't perfect, I never thought there was anything fishy going on between her and Luke. I dismissed it at the time, but in retrospect, there might have been clues, such as her laughing a little too much at his jokes or spending a lot of time in his room watching movies on his big TV. I had faith in both of them. Since then, I've learned a lot. When I got home from work that evening, they were both acting oddly. They were being really polite, as if they were trying to keep things as normal as possible. Luke suggested getting a burger, and Rachel offered to make dinner, but she never did. I didn't think much of it at the time, but it felt strange. I decided to go along with it, reasoning that they were just in a good mood or something. I wasn't interested in overthinking it because I was exhausted, but one night the situation really got to me around 2 a.m. When I woke up the next morning, my phone buzzed with a text from Sam, a mutual friend. It was a screenshot of a conversation in which Rachel had been candid about her and Luke having been hooking up for months. My mind began to race. I felt like I'd been punched when I saw the screenshot on my phone. Sam only responded, "Dude, you needed to know?" I felt like the room was closing in on me. He wouldn't play around with me about something like this. This was the woman I was thinking about proposing to. She was my friend, and I'd allowed her to stay with us. While I was away, Rachel and Luke had deceived me on every occasion I had spent with them. I felt like a complete idiot. I didn't even have time to think before I jumped up, bounded down the hallway, and rushed into Luke's room without knocking. They appeared really guilty as they were lying on his bed, looking really panicked. Rachel started stuttering, saying it just happened and that she'd wanted to tell me. Was it meant to cheer me up? I can't remember half of what I said. There was a lot of shouting. Luke tried to look tough. He said it wasn't a big deal because he didn't think Rachel and I were working well together anyway. Rachel seemed close to tears as she sat there. I didn't care though. She had months to tell me she wasn't happy. She and Luke had done this behind my back, even though I'd asked them to end our relationship for months. When things eventually settled down, I told them to leave. I just wanted them out of my sight, wherever they went. Luke tried to speak with me, saying he hadn't meant for things to get this bad. It was the worst. Rachel kept apologizing, saying she never meant for things to end this way. I was so desperate to leave that apartment that night I collapsed on Sam's couch. They both threw away whatever they thought would help me feel better, but to me it was all rubbish. I decided I was done after what seemed like 0 hours of sleep. The following morning I went back to the apartment to get my belongings. They were both still there, avoiding eye contact as one might expect, saying she didn't want to lose me. As a friend, Rachel tried to stop me from going. She did something that friends don't do. I ignored the apologies, packed up what I could find and put it in boxes and bags. I decided to cut all ties with the people involved as soon as I left. I figured our mutual friends would find out, so I kept it a secret. It felt like no one cared, which was hard. I was clearly on my own since even though some people texted their apologies for the drama, they still went out with Rachel for me. I decided to let go of everything and everyone. I returned to my hometown, deleted my social media accounts, changed my phone number and stopped communicating with that group of friends. It wasn't easy to start over. Sometimes I questioned whether I was being too severe or allowing my rage to rule me. However, I would recall the expressions on Rachel's and Luke's faces when I faced them as if I were somehow at fault. After a difficult couple of years of reconstructing my life, things started to get better. The betrayal was severe and I wasn't going to pretend. Otherwise, I started rebuilding myself, gradually making new friends and getting my career back on track. After a while, I met Mia, a lady who was devoted, honest, and truly respectful. She was everything Rachel wasn't. She was aware of my background and recognized that I had moved on from it. She never attempted to dig up old wounds or pry them open. I began to experience true happiness once more. Years later, I was engaged to a remarkable woman and at last felt unburdened by all of that baggage. I believed I had moved on from the past, however I couldn't have been more wrong. As it turned out, Luke and Rachel still had some unfinished business with me. I was living a very different life now. I was engaged to Mia and happier than I had been in years. We announced our engagement on social media with a picture of us and a message about our future. I wasn't really active on social media, so I thought it would only be seen by a few friends and family. But that post was all it took to open a door I had assumed was closed. I'd assumed it had been closed. I got a notification a few days after I published it. It was Rachel's message. I nearly dropped my phone when her name appeared on my screen. Why had she suddenly decided to get in touch after all these years of silence? Every memory, grief, and betrayal from that night seemed to resurface as I gazed at her name. My initial reaction was to erase the message and put it out of my mind. I sat there, wondering what could have led her to believe that I would want to hear from her just now. After a few minutes, I thought it would be best to leave. I hadn't read the message and I'd already blocked her. The real issue was that I didn't want any secrets between us, so I told Mia about it that evening. She laughed it off and said I'd made the right decision. She also blocked Rachel, just in case. But this was only the start of it. Even though we thought Rachel had found closure and would move on, it wasn't long before we saw random profiles popping up. They were just friend requests, with no posts or images. And they all had generic profile pictures and ambiguous names. It was pretty obvious that Mia had rejected Ed. As soon as she realized something was wrong, we both thought Rachel was behind it. She was trying to get into our lives in the most immature way possible. She was playing social media games like we were still in high school, even though I hadn't thought about her in years. I finally lost my patience and deleted all of my social media accounts. It was just not worth it, though. Before I deleted my account, I got a final message from a new profile that I think was Rachel's. She was trying to get in touch with me. She was trying to get my attention by saying she wanted to talk. I quickly replied with a brief message ordering her to stop bothering me and blocked her right away. I didn't wait around to hear back. I deleted my account in the hopes that it would be the last one. I assumed she would move on since she had no way to get in touch with me for a few days. Nothing happened then, unexpectedly. My sister Alyssa called. I thought she wanted to catch up or inquire about the engagement because we are close, but don't often communicate. I could tell something wasn't right by the tone. She said, "Ben, we need to talk." She told me that Rachel had contacted her, but not in a friendly way. Rachel had even sent her a picture of a boy she said I had no knowledge of. I laughed at first, but then I realized that Alyssa was serious. As she continued, I understood that Rachel had sent Alyssa more than one letter. She had also sent her lots of pictures of a child who, in her she said my opinion looked just like me. She was really panicked in her messages, saying she never meant to keep this a secret. I tried to brush it off as just another of Rachel's attention-grabbing antics. I told Alyssa that if this were true, Rachel would have stepped out years ago. She would have waited until I got engaged. But why the timing seemed so convenient? Alyssa wasn't laughing, though. I couldn't concentrate for the next few days because, as she told me, Rachel seemed really frantic. I could tell by the tone of her voice that she wasn't sure. I had to decide what to believe. While I was at work, my thoughts kept returning to Rachel and this alleged son. I felt sick at the thought of having a child I'd never met. I didn't want to tell Mia immediately because I didn't want to involve her in a situation that I couldn't ignore it. I had to know whether there was any truth to this. After days of struggling with myself, I made the decision to act. I didn't want to play Rachel's game, so I wasn't going to approach her directly. I thought a lawyer would be able to help me deal with it, so I called him instead. I told him everything, including the messages, the infidelity, and the son claim. After listening to it all, he said he'd write Rachel a formal letter asking for proof that she was being sincere. He said the letter would be enough to scare her off if this was just a ruse. The letter was like a weight off my shoulders. I felt like I could finally breathe normally again. I even began to unwind, believing that everything would be fine. However, a few days later, my lawyer called me again and requested a meeting. I assumed he would simply inform me that Rachel had forgotten, but he handed me an envelope and said, When I sat down in his office, there were multiple pictures of a little boy inside. I was unsure about how to react because the child in the pictures seemed remarkably similar to me. Same eyes, same dark hair. It reminded me of an old picture of myself. According to my lawyer, Rachel supplied these pictures and a note with her version of events around the time she caught him with Luke. She said she'd been trying to get pregnant again, but she and Luke realized Luke was sterile. They'd kept the baby quiet because they thought it was his. But then they started to have doubts. My mind was racing. I still had a feeling this was some kind of trick. A way of getting me back into her life. I was convinced that Rachel was lying. I asked my lawyer to arrange a DNA test because I wasn't going to believe her story without proof. It was excruciating to wait for the results. My mind was on autopilot. My lawyer finally called after what felt like an eternity. The test results were positive. I wasn't sure what to think. The boy was mine. I felt relief, shock, and rage all at once. After years of trying to forget and move on, I now had a son. I had never heard of him. It was a devastating realization due to lies and deceit. I had missed his first 5 years. Luke had been raising him as though he were his own. I had a lot of questions and feelings. I couldn't believe they'd managed to hide this from me. How could Rachel have only now come forward after noticing my happiness and success? She didn't seem to care about me or our son. It seemed like she'd only sought out the truth because she saw something she could benefit from. The betrayal was more painful than I'd ever experienced, but I had to set that rage aside for the time being. I wasn't going to let it affect me. I told my lawyer that I was happy to pay child support, and that I wanted visitation rights. After everything they had concealed, I wasn't going to let them define my level of involvement. However, Luke lost it the moment the visitation request was made. My lawyer says he doesn't want me to confuse his child. He said he was the only father my boy needed and that he needed to keep things private so my son wouldn't become confused. This was my son, and yet he was acting as though I was the outsider, as if he had the right to tell me I didn't belong. However, I refused to accept it. I instructed my attorney I made it clear that if I were to be involved in my son's life, I would do so as his father and not as a supporting character. This was about my son and I was determined to be in his life, whether they liked it or not. I knew this wouldn't be easy, but I had already made up my mind. If they couldn't accept that, I would set up a fund for him and leave them. I wasn't going to play any part in whatever game they were playing. Rachel and Luke weren't going to decide for me whether or not I would be involved in my son's life. They made things difficult as was to be expected. When my lawyer tried to set up a meeting in the hopes that we could agree on visitation terms, Luke flatly refused. He wrote a lengthy email in which he said I should be the real dad and that allowing me inside would disrupt his son's life. It was as though I were a stranger who was going to completely upend everything. Rachel continued to act as a mediator, but her interpretation of compromise was absurd. He used terms like stable environment and family unit as if I were some intruder in my own son's life. On her terms, she proposed that I see my son saw me occasionally throughout the year, but only while Luke wasn't present. She wanted to keep things low-key, but I told my lawyer to make it clear that if I was paying child support, I'd be an active, involved father. I didn't want to act like some distant family friend. As I expected, they flipped out. Rachel used guilt-tripping language in her emails, saying I was harming my son by refusing to contribute financially without accepting their demands. Luke went on a rant, calling me selfish and saying I was trying to destroy their family to ease my conscience. He even called my son a mistake. They kept going on and on about how I was only there because I didn't want to face up to my past mistakes. It went on for weeks, and I was really angry that they were using my son as a bargaining chip. They'd push back with another guilt trip or another attempt to get me to back down every time I thought we were close to a deal. I was trying to make a fair arrangement. There were times when I wanted to give up and walk away from the whole thing because the emails and legal battles were exhausting. But I thought about my son and how he might one day ask who his real father was. I couldn't leave him in that state of uncertainty. We finally got them to agree to a meeting after what seemed like months of back and forth. He wanted to know that I'd fought to be in his life and that I hadn't just given up because it was inconvenient. Rachel arrived first, looking anxious as if she were about to give a major business presentation. A few minutes later, Luke came in with a frown on his face and sat down without even looking at me. Rachel started talking, going on and on about how she'd kept the truth from me because she thought it was for the best. That was her go-to excuse. I was really annoyed by her excuses. The atmosphere in the room was tense, but I was ready to face them and argue for my right to be involved in my son's life. How could they keep a father away from his son? She tried to explain that they had both honestly thought Luke was the father until she realized I wasn't buying it. They should have stepped out as soon as they discovered he wasn't the father. Luke eventually spoke up after they waited and started making me jump through hoops. I told him he was wrong. I taught him how to tie his shoes, read, and ride a bike. I've witnessed every fight and every soccer match. He proudly displayed all of his dad moments. I could relate to that in some way. When I couldn't be there, he was. That did not imply that I would now take a back seat. My son and I had a right to get to know each other. We spent hours debating the same topics over and over again. They said that letting me in would confuse him, and that he needed stability. It was as if my presence as his father would cause anarchy. In reality, they wanted things to stay the same. They wanted me to be a supporting character, there for financial reasons, not for a genuine relationship. Eventually, my lawyer got involved. He made it very clear that I would have regular visits with my son if they wanted my financial support. Luke seemed ready to explode, as if my son's life were on his schedule. Rachel made one last attempt to change things by suggesting we could revisit the situation in a year or two once he's older. However, I had had enough of making concessions, so I told them I would transfer the support funds. I'd put the money in a savings account that my kid could access when he turned 18. If I didn't have equitable visitation, at least he'd know that I wanted to be there. Rachel's face fell when I said that. She hadn't expected me to be so determined. Maybe she thought I'd just pay up and leave. But that wasn't going to happen. I was adamant that the discussion was over. I left the room without a decision because I wanted my son to know who I was and that I was willing to stand up for him. I felt exhausted but also more determined than ever. Despite their desire for me to become less involved in my son's life, I refused to do so. They were no longer the focus of this. The following weeks were calm. It was about my son and my right to be a part of his world. I kept fighting for legal rights with my lawyer. My lawyer and I were prepared for a lengthy legal battle. My fiancée Ashley was a constant source of support, listening to me vent and helping me plan my next steps. One evening, as we discussed the future, Ashley gave me some wise advice that really resonated with me. She helped me stay focused and avoid getting too frustrated. She was right when she said that my son deserves to know his real dad and that he'll thank me one day for fighting to be there. This has nothing to do with making amends or retaliating against Rachel and Luke. After this, I was even more determined to give my son the chance to understand who I am. I wanted to make sure he had a genuine relationship with his father, no matter how long it took. I was going to see this through to the end. My kid had been kept away from me for years by Rachel and Luke, but I refused to let them continue to rule both my life and his. As a result, I am now battling for the right to fatherhood is one of the toughest things I've ever done, and there's still a way to go. But I'm determined not to back down. My kid will eventually learn the truth and see that I did everything I could to support him, and that I didn't let the past come between us. The future is uncertain, but I'm ready for whatever it brings. It's likely to be filled with additional challenges, but I intend to stay in this for the long run for my son and for the future. I won't give up until I get to where I belong. Despite Rachel and Luke's persistent resistance, months went by with court dates, back and forths, and more annoyance than I could have ever imagined. My lawyer and I kept at it, no matter how many hurdles they tried to put in my way. I was determined to fight for my son, and eventually, we came to an agreement. It wasn't everything I wanted, but it was a start. I was granted regular visitation rights, which allowed me to spend a set amount of time with my son. I was able to spend a set amount of time with my son each month without Luke, or Rachel getting in the way. It felt like a minor triumph, but it was enough. On the day of my first visit, I was anxious and unsure of how things would turn out, but I was finally able to get to know my son and be a part of his life. When I got to the park, I was really nervous. I'd only ever seen him in pictures, but it was like everything came together when I eventually saw him sprinting in my direction. He was a boy who shared my curiosity and appearance, and I could see the likeness. He was really striking. We chatted, played, and I listened as he showed me his favorite games and toys over those first 2 hours. Despite my nervousness, he simply looked at me with open interest, ready to play. It seemed as though all the years I had missed didn't matter during those little hours I was at last. It was a great chance to get to know him and be the father I'd always wanted. When he called me Dad for the first time, I left the park feeling both hopeful and heartbroken. I knew that moment would always be a part of me. I was heartbroken to realize how many moments I'd missed. I knew I'd never be able to get back those lost moments, but I was also hopeful that I was now a part of his life. That was something I had to accept. It wasn't easy, of course, but all I could do was keep going and make the most of my remaining time. To be honest, it was best for Rachel and Luke to stay apart despite their best efforts to keep. I was already there, so I knew I wasn't going anywhere. They eventually came to terms with that. They didn't have to like it, but they started to understand that I wasn't just going to write checks and leave. I was here to stay, and Mia was my constant support system. She even came with me on a few visits. On a few visits to get to know my son better, I discovered a piece of the future I was unaware I was missing. I watched them together and saw how naturally she connected with him, with me by her side. I felt stronger and more determined to be the father my son needed as Mia and I planned our wedding. The idea of having my son there became a new fantasy. She was going to make an amazing stepmother. I began to see him standing next to me, possibly as my best man in the future. I knew that he would be there, a genuine part of my life and family, despite the hardship. It made the fight worthwhile. It's not the happily ever after, but it's a start. Some people might say it's wishful thinking, but I believe it's the truth. I know the struggle was worthwhile every time he laughs, grins, or calls me Dad. He might not know everything yet, but he will eventually. As for Rachel and Luke, they're doing their own thing now and embracing that. I'm a part of his life. I want him to grow up knowing that I fought to be there and that I didn't let distance or falsehoods keep us apart. I'm fine with the fact that I don't think we'll ever get along. They understand that I'm here to stay, and in a sense, that's enough for me. My son has made the long and challenging the trip was worthwhile at every turn. When he's old enough, I'll tell him the tale so he can see how badly I wanted to be his father. I'm not trying to force him to take sides or harbor animosity toward anyone. I'm thankful for the opportunity to be there for the time being, and I'll continue to be there as long as he has me.